Hello and welcome to Fanatic. This show will be another piece on Black Library writing, so the Black Library submissions process, but also generally writing and what to do as an IP writer working for a company, which is a very different thing than writing for yourself. But we've got two guests on who have experience of that. David Guymer, who actually came through the Black Library submission process, and Laurie Goulding, who was an editor for the process as well, although a few years ago. If you enjoy what we're doing, then please feel free to tell your friends. Subscribe through your podcatcher. Go and follow the show on Twitter at FanaticCast. On Facebook, we have a page, and if you really like what's going on with the show, then you can also visit the Patreon. And you can find the links for that in the show notes, or you can search for Greg Dan on Patreon. But we'll leave the end of the show just to fade out and jump straight into the subject. Okay, well, joining me we have David Guymer. Hello, David.
Hi, Greg.
How are you doing?
Well, thanks.
Excellent stuff. And from a little further overseas now, Mr. Laurie Goulding.
Yeah, hello. I'm joining you from sunny Los Angeles, where yesterday it was hailing. So, I guess occasionally the sunshine has to break.
Yeah, there we go. You've had everything in the last few months, haven't you?
Yeah, wildfires. Feels like torrential downpours of rain, blistering sunshine, snow, hail. It's hard not to think of the apocalypse at this time, but I've got a motorbike. It'll be like Mad Max. It'll be fine.
Excellent. So we got you guys on to talk a little bit about the Black Library submissions window. Now, Laurie, we've got you on your experiences with previous ones, and might not be, you might not have all the details as current, but
yeah. I mean, I that was where I came into Black Library, and was it 2011? I was the submissions editor, and I was taking over from Christian Dunn in that regard of actually reviewing any material that was submitted to Black Library, anything that came in either from the submissions window, from readers who wanted to get involved in the writing, but also from established writers who wanted to contribute to Black Library as well. But my experience is, I should say that right at the beginning, my experience is very much from those days. I cannot possibly speak for what Black Library are doing now. I'm not entirely fully aware of what they're doing now, but I think some of the principles are still universal. I think a lot of it's still going to be relevant.
Sure, and you still write for stuff.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
As well. And David, do you want to explain how you're relevant to this part of the conversation, or this conversation, should I say?
Yeah, so I guess we're both here, Laurie and I, because Laurie was still submissions editor when I submitted through the Black Library open submission window in 2013, I think.
Yeah, I think it was. Is it 2012 or 2013? Yeah, that was
published in 13 anyway.
Yes, I think it was the year before. This all starts to blur together for me with year on year, purely because of the number of submissions that I had to review in that time. And I can't remember, it might have been 2013 when we took a break from it because we received 3,300 submissions, which I had to review every single one. So you can understand a lot of this starts to bleed together for me.
Is something that I always talk about, actually, that there wasn't one. So yeah, let's say I got in the 2013 window. There wasn't one in the following year or the year after, I think. And I always remember that because I wasn't completely sure about submitting. I didn't feel ready, and I thought about waiting. And so I always remember now that there wasn't one for several years after. And I certainly don't regret just jumping in and going for it.
Sure, that's the first lesson.
So we certainly didn't regret you actually submitting. That would have been, who would have finished Gotrek and Felix otherwise?
Indeed. So I think so the first lesson there is if you're interested, submit, because you never know. and you never know what the situation is going forwards. But just want to talk about the huge numbers of that. So when you were submissions editor, Laurie, was that all shorts? Was that all... what kind of size of documents were you looking at the time?
Oh, yeah, no, I mean, like a lot of this, there was the legacy of previous submissions windows that Christian and the other editors had been dealing with before I was at Black Library. They had two there was the overall rule was like there's no Horus Heresy submissions and no Time of Legend submissions. You could submit either 40k or fantasy, nothing else. It kept it simple. But there was two submission windows, one for short stories in each of the settings, and one for novels. And I think a short story, you could submit up to a 10,000 word short story in its entirety. And for the novel, you had to do a pitch, a breakdown of what you wanted the whole story to be, and then the first 3 chapters. And it was up to the writer to decide how long a chapter was.
Blimey.
So the variety of content that we received, like, some of the submissions would be just 1,000-word flash fiction, and some of them would be sometimes many hundreds of pages of text. And I always give Christian a hard time about this now. It was so funny because it was proven true. When I first arrived, he said, good luck, here you go. He handed over a big plastic crate which had every submission they received. And some of these things were amazing. Like, people had handwritten manuscripts. Like, I don't just mean like pen on paper. I'm talking about like calligraphy manuscripts on stained paper and sealed with the Aquila on a wax seal and everything. Like, people really took a lot of time making these artifacts. But then you'd read the first 2 paragraphs and it was quite apparent this wasn't a style of writing or a level of craft expertise that was usable. And so you'd have to then throw this thing away. And I felt so bad on so many other occasions. But he said to me, you're going to find any reason to reject a submission. You'll get super cynical. And I was like, no. Everybody gets a fair try at this. And I'll read every submission. I'll read it all the way to the end. And then, when you're 2,000 submissions in and you start to just realize, you can tell within the first few paragraphs whether or not somebody has an interesting story idea or a unique voice. And we joked afterwards. I said, hey, I'll now reject a submission if somebody spelt their name wrong. And like it was the worst kind of cynicism to have. But when you have that many submissions coming in, when you see a really exceptional piece of writing, or you see somebody that has a unique voice, that jumps out and it makes it that much clearer. And I think actually that leads nicely to David's submission, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. What was your thought process in your submission, David?
So long ago now. I mean, I think... So my memory is that it had to be an excerpt of I can't remember how long it was, but I'm pretty sure I didn't submit the whole thing. Probably a few thousand words, I think, went in.
I think we'd shortened it down and said, even for short stories, we want just one scene, like maybe a few thousand words maximum. Just enough to get the idea of the story across.
And it didn't specify, I don't think, that it had to be the beginning. So there's a lot of... I think I did finish the story first and then spent a lot of time thinking, okay, what's the best bit of this story to send in to this exciting part? And in the end, it did actually end up being the beginning. But that...
I'm trying to remember, like, when you submitted it, it was the Skaven story specifically, wasn't it? It was like, this is going to be... It became, for anybody that's not aware, David's submission became the Gotrek and Felix story, the Tylian's Talisman.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to remember how did you initially set that story up, David? Because it wasn't Gotrek and Felix, was it? I'm having trouble remembering. It was so long ago.
It initially started as a couple of lowly clan rats who had snuck in to an Arabian town ahead of an invasion in order to try and pinch a magical item that owned by a Tylian merchant, hence the title. And it's basically like a small adventure in a tavern, basically a couple of Skavens sneaking through a tavern unnoticed to ambush a merchant. And I think the feedback was that, this is great, we like it. you can clearly write, but no one really cares about a couple of clan rats in an Arabian tavern and a Tillian merchant. Why don't we make it a Gotrek and Felix story?
Okay.
There's a context for that as well. So Christian had, after I'd taken over from him, he'd started focusing on producing anthologies, and one of the first ones that he was talking about was let's do a selection of Gotrek and Felix stories. And he said at the time, look out for flag up any submission you receive that is Gotrek and Felix. And there were a few. There were a few in that huge pile. He said, put those aside, and we will look at them separately. But also, any story you think could be Gotrek and Felix, put that aside as well. I remember the feedback I had when I took your story and a few others to the room of editors and said, this guy David Guymer, I love his use of language, his descriptions. I'm not sure where we would actually put this story. There's no known character to hang it off. Could this be a Gotrek and Felix story? And that's where that came from. It was specifically because we knew there was going to be a product that required Gotrek and Felix stories.
Sure, that's useful. So I think there's a lesson there. We had John French and I think it was Kate on Warhammer TV a while ago talking about the process a little bit, and the nature of what you enter might not work on that. This is very much, you have to prove you have what it takes to be a Black Library writer.
There's this universal truth with all of this stuff. As I say, when I was there, I was also responsible for looking at any submissions that came from established writers, people that have been published in other places. There's far more than the actual content of your submission. It's more about, does this demonstrate good writing? Is there an understanding of characters? Is this a compelling, narrative voice? Is this author demonstrating an understanding of the way that stories need to be told when you're talking about within a specific intellectual property or a license, in this case, Warhammer? But then there's also just this idea of, is somebody open to, from the beginning, being told, we love your style, but we actually are not interested in this submission. Could you work on something else? How about... And then you give them a suggestion. There are a lot of people, I'm not sure if this is still the case. I saw this all the time. People would send in submissions and say, here is my submission for a novel. If Games Workshop doesn't want it, I assert myself as the copyright owner and I will be pursuing publication with other publishers after this point. That is another red flag straight away. It's like, you don't own Warhammer stories, even if you've written them. It's a derivative work in an established intellectual property. Legally, you do not own it. You cannot take it to another publisher. And if it's a story that you could change to not be Warhammer, that's not going to be Warhammer enough for Black Library. So there's an intrinsic level of Warhammerness that has to go into these stories. And if you can repurpose it to be a different IP or an original fantasy or science fiction story, it's not going to get through the submissions process. And a lot of people... if somebody's asserting straight away, if you don't like my story, I'll take it elsewhere. Why are you submitting this to a Black Library open submission window then? That was the death of a lot of submissions. It's just this unwillingness to enter into any kind of editorial conversational process. Sure,
yeah. So David, how I don't know your background in terms of writing in Games Workshop and everything else. Were you a Games Workshop fan for a long time?
Yeah, so I first got into Games Workshop stuff through Space Crusade.
Okay, dating yourself now.
I don't know how old I was when I first got that, but when I first got my miniatures, I remember I was 12, because I remember they were obviously lead and they had the little note on the back saying you have to be 13. So I remember being a year too young to actually.
Awesome.
And the clan Skavens, obviously, hence the going on to pitch a Skaven story. And I sort of stuck with that. I sort of fell out at university just for practical reasons, but then once I finished, got back in again. But in terms of writing, I had no real inclination to doing it at school. was no particular prodigy in terms of English language or any kind of creative subject.
Okay, well, I think that's good.
I think actually, David, it's really interesting. Like, if you just explain what your background was, like, if not a writer, if not a struggling, starving creative locked in an attic somewhere, like, what was your background? Because I found this fascinating when I found out.
So, well, I was a scientist. I sort of always loved science at school, and did degree, PhD, worked for a couple of years. And I think it was during my PhD when I first started to think about a story idea. Came from nowhere, really. I still haven't written it. I've had a few stabs at it before I found the Black Library submission window and submitted to that, and then of course got busy writing Black Library stories. And now I look back, I don't think that idea was anything special anyway. Where are we going with this?
That's right.
See, this is where David really excels, is in planning out his plots in advance.
But it's good to know.
So, as a scientist by training and original inclination.
Sure. I think there can be an attitude, particularly amongst writers, that people who want to be writers, if they haven't done it for long enough, they're not good enough. I haven't, as you say, I haven't slaved away, locked away in my room, writing hundreds of documents to be thrown away to find my masterpiece, where that's not always the way. And in fact, people who do that aren't necessarily good writers. Just doing that doesn't make you a good writer. It might help you develop if you're in the feedback the right way.
It's a skill like any other. Practice improves it. Yeah. But I think there's also something to be said for the sheer passion and lack of guile of an amateur to produce something full of energy and ideas, which someone who does it every day can develop a sort of tunnel vision and perhaps a sort of almost a muscle memory.
Sure.
Lacks a bit of that.
Laurie, from an editor's point of view with Black Library, were there times where you saw people and thought, okay, that there are aspects of that you learn how to write a book, but we can work on them with people?
Absolutely. That's sure. You've summed it up exactly in the words I was going to use. We did a lot of those courses. Sorry, that sounds far too formal and academic. We did a lot of those seminars and the days for at the Black Library events where we would coach people in writing and improving their writing. And one of the standard things was, if somebody has a glimmer of ability and a glimmer of talent and an enthusiasm for writing, and they understand the IP, we can work with that. Sure. And believe it or not, we know a thing or two about how to edit people and to work with them to develop their craft and develop their expertise, develop their own voice, and to become writers where they have just the ability to write in the beginning. I still struggle, writing myself, anything more than 10,000 words. The first novel that I did, it pretty much broke me. And it took me so long to, and I was always joking and reprimanding, Aaron Dembski-Bowden or Dan Abnett, and say, come on, where's the words? Give me the words you owe me. And then I would sit down and try and do it myself. Oh wow, this is actually really hard. Just actually sustaining the writing effort night in, night out. There's the quote that I frequently bring up on the screen. It's if you want to imagine what it's like to be a writer, imagine having homework every night for the rest of your life. It's if that doesn't appeal to you, you're not going to be a writer. And there's a lot of people as well who would come to these things who burned with a passion to write for Black Library, and indeed write, just to be writers at all, who are so full of enthusiasm, but then the minute they see, wow, you mean I'm just going to have to keep writing forever? Prolific writers like David, Guy Haley, my God, he's a word machine. He never, ever stops writing. It's every single day. 7 days a week, he's just constantly writing. And if that doesn't sound fun to you, then you probably shouldn't be a writer. It's not going to pay off quickly. But another thing that I would always say to people is just read. And I'm not talking about reading Games Workshop books or Black Library books. If you're only reading franchise fiction set within the intellectual property that you're interested in, that's all you're ever going to produce. Everything you produce will be the sum of what you've read and what you've understood and the insights that you've had from it. And if it's only taken from that specific pool, your references and your style isn't going to be broad enough. It's not going to be like developed enough, because you don't read enough outside of that genre, outside of that publisher, or outside of that character. You're only ever going to produce something that's derivative of it. So we're like, if you want to write, you have to be able to write, and if you want to write, you have to be able to read. And if it doesn't sound like you want to do that every day for the rest of your life, then you probably don't really want to be a writer.
So how's that gone for you, Dave? Because you've just gone full time writing, haven't you?
Yeah, since July, and you do notice the difference. So when I was still working full time in the lab, you'd be sort of you'd be noticing the time that you didn't have to write, and you'd think, oh, how much more could I do if I have to be here? And as it turns out, it's not actually a huge amount more. It's because your mind can be focused.
Sure.
But you just physically cannot use every hour in the day to work at full whack.
No.
Because it is harder than you think to sit at a desk and plug the mind into the right place and make words which are not rubbish.
I struggle just to write event packs. I really do.
So, yeah, I mean, I try not to work weekends. It's sort of like the Faustian bargain with my girlfriend. I'll help out with the family on weekends. But it's still hard. You don't have holidays anymore. Bank holidays and Easter and Christmas. Christmas Day, of course, you don't work, but there's no 2-week break or anything like that.
I found the same actually when I was when I used to do the video content production for Games Workshop and Black Library before I started working as an editor at Black Library. I basically ran my own media production sort of business, like little studio. Holidays, forget it. Like, you do not get holidays if you're working freelance. Like, I would find reasons to take a holiday would be, hey, I'm going to do some filming in Mallorca for this company that I'm working with. Guess what? I'm going to stay an extra 2 days. That's my holiday for this year. Mainly because, can't afford holidays if you're a writer.
Oh, it's all fun. It's all fun. Yeah, okay, that's pretty excellent. Moving, I just want to kind of bring it back to the submissions window a little bit. So this year, they've done, because it's 20 years of Black Library this year, and they're bringing back Inferno. They're looking for stories for that, which is pretty cool. They've actually given 6 narratives that you have to write to. Heist, detective/police procedural, adventure, mystery, ghost, paranormal or horror, or war.
That's so cool. That's such a great idea.
It really is.
I wish I'd thought of that.
We were... standard. Michael and I were talking about this previously on the show. We feel that opens... I think it will help guide some people. But it also feels like...
it sort of covers everything in a way, doesn't it? Apart from romance.
Not much.
It's interesting that you can kind of guide the creative process with this stuff. If it's completely open-ended, people might try and do everything in one, and you'd find stories that are unfocused because they're trying to be a war story, romance with, elements of police procedure, detective, but it's also a heist, as opposed to just saying, just write a heist. Just do that. And even just having just that theme in mind, and all the ideas that you've got that don't fit that idea, suddenly you're like, oh, okay, as a prospective writer, an aspiring writer, I put all those ideas on the ideas board for another day, and I'm just going to focus on making this the best heist story it can be. That's such a great idea. That's really cool. I wish I'd paid more attention to that.
It's probably worth mentioning that a short story doesn't really need too many ideas because it is short.
Yeah.
Even 10,000 words, which, is quite a long short story, it still only really needs one good idea to hang off, and obviously, plenty of great characters and good writing in the middle. But you can't be full of ideas, otherwise, none of them have got room.
Absolutely, it's just kind of a hot mess. And it becomes really more obvious when you've got that limited space to work in. I kind of like the idea of genre Black Library fiction as well. I think, because it's fair to say we've seen those elements in, specifically in stories, and some writers lean more towards one like David Annandale, very much the paranormal horror kind of thing going on, that kind of thing. So I sort of hope this leads to a little bit more kind of genre fiction within Black Library. Not too much, just enough, you know what I mean?
I mean, it gives it a flavour, doesn't it? It gives you things that you can hang the IP from, like, you're not going to get a Space Marine romance unless there's been a huge fundamental shift in attitude at Games Workshop since I was there.
Or Aaron's gone rogue.
But then, like, the idea of having Space Marines being sent to do an investigation was always something we were told, like, no, that's not what Space Marines do. But then you can create a really interesting story idea if a Space Marine is forced to take part in basically an investigation. It's like, but this is not what I'm created for. This is not where my expertise lies as a servant of the Imperium. But I guess I've been co-opted by this group to help with this investigation, or I'm now a bodyguard for this guy, and creating those kinds of character roles within a wider story idea, like you say, genre fiction. I think that's kind of cool. Yeah,
absolutely. And then they've actually got some nice rules here as well. So we get you have to send in a 1-paragraph summary and a sample of the story no longer than 500 words in length.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's really short.
Yeah, they've learned a lot then from having 3,000 odd entries.
Yeah. Yeah. The amount of pain that it generated when, I mean, even just in like 2016, like when we had a pile of submissions that have been hanging around since Black Library left, like the main studio, there was a huge backlog of stuff from that, and there was also the new stuff that was coming in, and the editors, there was like 4 of us at that point, and just all of us just saying, like, okay, let's just divide this pile up. We've got loads of other stuff to be getting on with as well, but like we need to go through these submissions. And the fact, just even then, when they were like 1,000 to 1,500 words in length, going through all of them and giving each of them a proper read and a proper assessment, we did have to kind of streamline the process. But if they cut it right down to 500, I mean, yeah, that's great. Like I say, you can usually tell within the first couple of paragraphs whether or not it has something that you're interested in. And it can be really subjective, like something that I would have found interesting, maybe Lindsay Priestley wouldn't have found interesting, or maybe Nick would have found something really, really cool, whereas like back in the day, Christian or Graham Lyon, they wouldn't have given it a second thought. And knowing the kind of stuff that your publisher and your editor would be looking for, or the kind of thing that would appeal to them, that can be really good knowledge. So, be nice to Nick, be nice to Lindsay, be nice to Kate, be nice to these people, and they'll tell you on social media what kind of things they're interested in and what movies they're watching. That would be my advice for anyone trying to write for Black Library now. Research the editors. And, send them cheese and cakes, because Black Library runs on cheese and cake.
Not in a creepy way. It's not
in a creepy way. No, don't like stalk them. Don't do that.
I like the fact, one thing, it's always going to happen. You see it all the time. It says, please submit correctly formatted work in Times New Roman, point size 12, double line spaced. And people saying, well, I don't like doing that. As you stated, you had 3,000. That would, if someone can't follow the rules, then how are they going to work within a structure where they have rules imposed upon them?
It's exactly that. It's that idea of, here are the very basic instructions you've been given. It doesn't matter how good your idea is if you can't even follow basic instructions. And they're not even hard and fast rules so much as like, here's a request from your publisher, the people who want to read your stuff, prospective submissions or otherwise. Can you please just make it legible? Can you just provide it in the way that they want to look at it? And yeah, it's another one of those things, say Christian telling me I would be really cynical deleting submissions or rejecting submissions rather if they weren't in the right format, or if there was a typo in the title or in the name, or it's such a simple ask to just. Also, if it says submit as a Word document, submit as a Word document.
Yes.
For God's sake, not as like PDF or not as a like Microsoft Works or like Final Draft or any of like. It doesn't matter what the industry's doing. If they're asking for Word, send it in Word.
Yeah, you're the one going to them for a job at the end of the day.
Yeah, exactly.
And I suppose as a writer, David, you go with ideas, and at the end of the day, Games Workshop have to green light what you want to do. So you can't be too precious about what you're doing either.
I mean, yeah. I mean, you basically you do whatever they say, and it can be a pain. I remember I had a story that it wasn't for Black Library. I sent it somewhere else, and it wasn't accepted, so I tried to send it to a couple of other places, and of course everyone's got their own slightly different rules, and the time it took to just reformat this story into sort of 3 or 4 different publishers, different requirements, wasn't an inconsiderable expenditure of time, but it's what you've got to do, because otherwise they're probably, I mean, I don't know, but they might not even give it a second glance if you've blown in the face of their polite requirements.
I have to say, if something comes in Comic Sans, like that's getting rejected. I'm sorry. Like I don't care if Aaron Dembski-Bowden submitted his latest masterpiece. If it came in Comic Sans, that's going straight back out the door.
Yeah, and people thought you wouldn't.
Twitter exchange would ensue.
He's going to hear this, and he's going to do it now. But luckily, I don't have to read his Black Library submissions, so he can. Oh no! Now they're going to come back at me and say Aaron submitted in Comic Sans as part of some internet joke. Why are you doing this?
It was all Laurie's fault. And there'll be that one guy online saying that Aaron's book never got made because Laurie made him submit it in Comic Sans.
That's it. That's exactly. There'll be. I'm sure there's a poster up somewhere in Black Library saying it's all Laurie's fault.
Yeah, not just there's certain bedrooms I think around the world as well.
I'm the righteous uncanon. Have you heard? It's amazing.
Absolutely. So we've got. I mean, they spoke on the stream about you can enter multiple times for this submission window as well. I would suggest if you're entering multiple times and some are weaker than others, that might not be as useful.
We always said we would rather see people, rather than submit 10 ideas and scattergun it, we would rather see the one great idea that you've worked on and you've drafted and you've redrafted. That's another thing. Don't send your first draft. Dear God, if you're going to submit something, if this is you wouldn't turn up for an interview for a job, and say well, this is just the first clothes that I pulled out of the wardrobe, and just, I've not really done any preparation or read, the guidelines of what your company does, but can I have a job? You've got to make it the best it can be and present it in the best possible way. Get feedback from other people. Show it to your friends. Show it to other people who are, give writing feedback. Show it around on the forums. Get some context. Get some suggestions for how you can improve it. But don't send in 10 ideas if they're all just the first things that occurred to you. They came straight from your brain to your fingers to the screen, submitted. That's probably, unless you are already a published writer with loads of experience and a developed voice of your own, that's not going to work.
What I always used to do, and would still love to do if I had the time to do it, is print off what I wrote and proofread it. A, reading it out loud, and make sure that it's not just mangled sentences, and B, do whatever proofreading I wanted to do with pen on the printout, because I found that my mind, both sort of writing mind and editing mind, works slightly differently with paper. I found looking at a screen, you can quite easily sort of skip over whole sections which probably need editing, whereas on a paper, I don't know why this is, but I found it so much easier to stop myself running on and correct what needs correcting.
I would agree with that, actually. When I'm editing anything, even now, working at Riot Games, I always prefer to read something on paper and jot down every little thought that I have and just, question mark, like a tick, or like, is this right? Or like, correct a spelling or something. And then when I finished, go back and look through everything that I've written down and decide which are the salient points and which are the things that I'm actually going to look at addressing. But just having that opportunity, because otherwise if you've got to type it into comments on a document, and then you've got to go and talk to the author, or if it's your own work, if you've then got to prioritize which things you want to change, like it's so much easier to work in the way that you think you're going to give yourself the most honest feedback, or you're going to give other people the most honest feedback. And if that's print it out and write on it, or do it on a screen, or read it out loud, whatever works. There's a great thing which I always like to do, and I would urge anybody who is trying to submit for a publisher to do this. Write down your first draft as early as you can. As soon as you know there's a submissions window, as soon as you know what the criteria are, write a draft and then leave it alone for 2 weeks, minimum 2 weeks, and go and do other stuff and don't think about it. Come back to it and read it out loud to somebody else. And if you find yourself cringing at anything you've written, that needs to change. Like, that's the bit. If you're not comfortable to say, this is my idea, and I would like to now present this to you verbally in my voice, if anything makes you uncomfortable at any level, that's the stuff you should think about changing. Because once something is published, if it does get published, if you're not happy with it, you're going to be cringing every time anyone ever mentions that story. And I have one story in particular that I wrote a long time ago. Anytime anybody asks me about it or talks about it, whether they say they like it or they didn't like it, it always makes me cringe a bit, because I know there's a section in that story which I almost cut and decided not to. So yeah, that's a great test. It's like, if you're not happy with reading it out to someone else after you've sat on it for 2 weeks, then it's probably not the best you can do.
Sure. David, did you have others looking at your entry before you sent it off?
I'm trying to remember. I don't think I did. I think I kept this under my hat, some sort of guilty secret.
Oh, right.
You are a crazy maverick. You answer to no one,
that I wanted to write or had indeed written.
Okay, that's fair enough.
In fact, after I was published, I don't think I told anyone I was working with for quite a while.
So I think it's fair to say that you might be...
Oh, by the way, the story.
It's fair to say that you might be not the typical person we'd talk to in that respect. I would probably advise that people do give it to someone they trust who can be honest with them. Because
when I wrote the first novel, for that one, I did get a couple of critical eyes.
Sure.
Critical eyes over it.
I know that personally, even something 500 words long, I have a tendency to, when I'm reading it, make the changes in my head without seeing them on the screen, because I know what I intended to write down.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a really easy trap to fall into. That kind of assumed knowledge of where you're coming from.
I think there's always a great thing when you ask for feedback from anybody, like a fellow writer or your editor, or just family member or friend whose opinion you value. Whether or not you agree with the feedback they give, whether they say, I don't know, I don't really understand what this character's motivation is, or like, I'd really love to see more about this thing he mentioned here about the laws of of that city or something. I'd love to see more on that. You might disagree with that. You might think, well, I don't think that's strictly relevant. But the point is that somebody else read your work and then made a decision like, I need to mention this because I don't understand it. Just to be aware that there is a possibility that people could read your work and think that it's a great way to just think like, am I taking account of this? Am I making sure that this, you've not got into a trap of just like, well, I think it's fine, therefore it's probably fine. Like any feedback is good feedback, but you don't have to necessarily act on it if you really don't think it adds anything.
Sure, that's good. I think we'll wrap it up in a little bit, conscious of time as much as anything. What are your top tips, David? We go to you. Say I'm sitting here, I've got an idea and I'm about to start writing it. What are your couple of top tips for me if I was doing that?
I I did a little bit of editing on like an independent sort of self-published anthology. I sort of agreed to do it, and a lot of the feedback I was getting was to put some real thought into that opening line. A lot of people clearly didn't think about it. Or another thing I often do when I'm writing is when I come to editing, I'll find that one of the main things I'm doing is essentially cutting the first 250 words off every chapter and the final 250 words off. So you're sort of taking a run up and a run down. But where you really want to start is a bit further on. So yeah, if you are submitting just 500 words, really take a look at what you're submitting and make sure it's only the essential bit that you're getting across to really tell your story in the most exciting and succinct way possible that is going to grab the editor's attention and not require some sort of run up through 200 words before you get there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that. That's good. And Laurie?
I have to say, if somebody is not, if somebody sees that there's a submissions window coming up and then starts to think about a story idea to submit for that window, I'd say for me that's already slightly alarming. Something that we see over and over again. If somebody wants to be a writer, they're already writing, even if there's no submissions window. Like, they're doing it for themselves because they love it. Like, sure. If you enjoy playing a sport, you don't wait until the Olympics before you start learning how to do that sport. You're already doing it, like, in your spare time. Every moment you get, you might just jot down some ideas or have a little practice. But, like, the idea of waiting until there's a submissions window before you even think about an idea, like, that's not the writer mindset, I think. And if you want to get, again, a good idea of what it's like to be a writer, you should always just be writing, even if it's just for fun and you're not going to show it to anyone. I mean, obviously, I'd encourage people to show it to someone just to get an idea of, how their audience might take it. But always be writing, even if there's not a submissions window, just for fun. I see people on Facebook and Twitter who post just little snippets of fiction that they're just writing, just about anything that's inspired them. They've seen a movie and they've written, 200 words of like something sort of based on that movie, or a book they've read, or just a situation they observed. There was a great exercise that I heard about, like, every day try and write 100 words of prose based on something you saw or heard that day. That's 100 words. It's a short email, and it's just try and write it in an interesting way. And it could be anything. And that's a great way to practice, even when there's no submissions window for Warhammer to build towards.
Yeah, I suppose if you want to become a full-time writer, even you're just forming the habit of sitting down and writing, whether you want to or not, as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And David hit this exactly on, before, talking about making that transition to being a full-time writer. You have to allocate your time, and it's like, you don't want to be staying up until 3 or 4 in the morning, but the inspiration's hit me now. It's like, how about instead do what David did and what every other writer who writes full-time for Black Library does, and that's, set yourself office hours, and at 6 p.m. it's time for dinner, and that's it. There's no more writing going on now. And having regular hours is definitely a thing. If you want to be productive, you want to be a full-time writer, you've got to have regular hours, because otherwise the self-discipline's too hard to push.
Excellent. Yeah. So, based on that, if you are thinking it might be too late for this submissions window, chances are there will be another one, and it doesn't necessarily have to be Black Library. You can get in other ways by becoming, as you say, a published writer and then coming in that way, different things like that. But there are also groups online. You can go to Facebook and find writing groups. Black Library Bolt Hole used to be, I don't know what it's like now, haven't been there in a while. People sharing their writing, things like that. A lot of forums to do that on as well. So there's lots of places to go if you want to do that. Thank you very much for coming on, gents. It's
no problem.
Really good.
Thank you.
Yeah, organising it all is always fun when we're doing transatlantic. So thank you for putting up with the times, you both.
So you guys are probably heading to bed soon. I've got to go and have my lunch. I've got a load of meetings this afternoon. That's the time difference for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I was over in Vegas not long ago. It's all good. I understand. And as I say, David, I will be reading all about Ferrus soon. So maybe at some point we'll get you back on to talk about that.
Awesome. Great.
Awesome. Excellent. Thank you very much. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.